We were clearing out scrap tanks in the desert when the sand beneath us suddenly caved in like a giant hole had opened up. Right after that, several thick, pitch-black legs covered in spikes, thicker than tree trunks, burst out of the ground. This monster, like a giant hermit crab, hoisted a 50 or 60-ton tank into the air, carrying it on its back like a shell. The iron plates and tracks clattered down as they were torn apart. I lay flat behind a sand dune to hide, the sun blazing down on the back of my neck. The collar of my combat suit stuck to my skin, burning hot. My mouth was full of sand. Every time I moved my tongue, my teeth ground together with a gritty sound. I looked up ahead, but my eyes couldn't focus. The sun was scorching, and the sand shimmered with waves of heat, making the air around me ripple. That's when I saw the tank. It was our M102, its rear end jacked up high, its front buried deep in a sand pit, and the whole thing was shaking violently. It trembled so hard that rivets popped out one by one, clattering onto the sand. The armor plates scraped against each other, letting out a piercing screech. Something strange was hiding under the tank. Several thick, black columns pushed up from deep in the sand, effortlessly lifting the 50 or 60-ton tank like it was made of cardboard. It took me a few seconds to realize those weren't pillars. They were living monster legs. Each leg was as thick as my waist, segmented, and covered in a hard, glossy black shell bristling with spikes. Sticky fluid oozed from the joints, trickling down the shell and stretching into thin strands as it dripped onto the sand. Every time the legs moved, a flood of slime surged from beneath the sand, making it bubble and gurgle. The tank's tracks gave out first. The entire left track snapped off, crashing to the ground with a noise like a collapsing iron shed. The main gun barrel was already bent, kinked at a sharp angle, its muzzle jammed straight into the sand. That barrel, once capable of piercing thick armor, was now twisted like a crushed straw. The seals around the turret edge burst apart one by one, flying off into the distance. I dug my fingers deep into the sand, my nails filling with grit, until I hit the hard-packed soil underneath. My throat felt like I'd swallowed sandpaper, tight and raw. I wanted to call for help, but no sound came out. The monster kept pushing upward, the tank's chassis rising higher and higher. Sand poured down its edges in streams, revealing the thicker bases of the legs underneath. An entire heavy main battle tank was being hoisted into the air by the underground monster, just like a hermit crab carrying a shell on its back. You're probably wondering why we ended up in that godforsaken place in the first place. 6 hours earlier, when our convoy rolled into this tank graveyard, the sun was blazing so fiercely it felt like we were being fried alive. This place was hidden deep in the Iraqi desert. On the map, it was marked with a red skull and a line of small text, "Scrapped Armored Vehicle Storage Area." In plain terms, it was a massive scrap metal dump, stretching for dozens of kilometers, piled high with wrecked tanks and armored vehicles dragged back from the battlefield. Some were burned out shells, others riddled with bullet holes. The air reeked of rust, mixed with a strange, sweet, metallic smell that crept into your nose with every gust of wind. Our mission was simple: inventory any usable parts and dispose of the scrap tanks that still held classified equipment. Higher-ups were worried someone might sneak in to strip parts for resale, and no one knew where those parts might end up. Johnson walked ahead of me, kicking a flattened oil can that clattered and rolled away. He turned back to me with a grin. "Smell that? Like rotten crap. Even the lizards won't hang around this dump." I said it was probably some small animal that died under a vehicle. He spat and said there wasn't even a blade of grass for miles around, so what animals could there be? We walked another 20 or so meters, and I stepped on something hard. Looking down, I saw a round hole in the sand. It was as wide as a bowl, with smooth edges, like it had been burned out by a red-hot pipe. A dark brown crust had formed around the hole. I kicked it with my boot, and it crumbled into powder. Underneath, there was dried, sticky stuff in the sand that stretched into thin strands when I pulled at it. I didn't think much of it at the time, figuring it was just a test hole left by a construction crew. Later, I realized these holes were everywhere, every few steps. Some were half buried in sand, others gaping open to the sky. We passed an M1A2 tank with so many bullet holes you could see light through them. The lubricant around the turret had long since dried and cracked, like the pattern on a turtle's shell. I deliberately took an extra look at the tank's chassis because the sand there was an odd color. Everywhere else was light yellow, but right under the chassis was a ring of dark brown, looking damp, as if it had just been disturbed. I crouched down and grabbed a handful. It felt sticky and wouldn't clump together, just kept trickling through my fingers. I muttered to myself, there wouldn't be a mine buried under here, would there? How come the engineers didn't clear it out? Johnson turned around and teased me, saying I was sun-drunk. This area had been swept by mine-clearing vehicles over a dozen times. Even a tiny shell casing would have been cleaned up. I didn't reply, because I was watching that wet sand slowly spread outward, seeping out bit by bit, like a broken underground pipe leaking water. I quickly stood up and walked away, glancing back every couple of steps. The dark sand patch kept expanding, and the whole surface was rising and falling very slowly, as if something huge had quietly turned over underground. Just then, the commander's radio crackled, telling us to head north to dismantle the armor plates from the batch of stored tanks at the far end. Miller and I were paired up. We skirted around a pile of burned-out off-road vehicle wrecks and headed toward the northwest corner. Over there, 7 or 8 tanks were parked, all covered in tattered camouflage nets. The ropes had long rotted away, and the frayed cloth strips fluttered wildly in the wind. Miller suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stood straight in the blazing sun, shielding his eyes with his hand and looking to the left. I urged him to keep moving, but he told me to wait and pointed at a tank in the distance, telling me to look quickly. I followed his gaze. About 50 yards away, an M1A2 sat alone, its barrel angled sideways. The engine had long been removed, the turret hatch wide open, revealing a pitch-black interior. I asked him what was wrong. Miller said quietly, "The turret on that tank just moved." I laughed on the spot, telling him he must be seeing things from the heat. Without an engine, how could the turret move on its own? But we both stood there, staring at that tank for a full half-minute. Then we saw it clearly. The turret was slowly rotating. It was moving at an absurdly slow pace, as if someone inside was nudging it bit by bit with their hands. Stop, move, stop, inch by inch to the right. A faint scraping sound of metal grinding against metal drifted over, as quiet as a mosquito's buzz. But in the dead silence around us, it was unmistakable. Then the whole tank suddenly sank. Just a single jolt, and the body dropped a notch, sand squeezing out from under the chassis and piling up in a ring. I stared at it, not daring to blink. The next second, the tank bounced back up, nearly half a meter into the air. That hunk of iron, tens of tons heavy, literally sprang off the sand and slammed back down, sending a dull thud through the ground that I could feel in the soles of my feet. Then the tank started sinking again, then bouncing up, each time with greater amplitude. Miller quietly took a step back and whispered, "There's definitely something alive under that tank, breathing and moving." When the sand suddenly exploded, I was only about 30 yards from that tank. In just 1 second, there was a deafening roar. The sand under the tank shot upward like it had been blasted by explosives, sand and gravel clattering against my helmet. I instinctively closed my eyes and ducked, my face stinging from the impact. When I looked up, that tens-of-ton tank had flipped over, like a giant turtle turned on its back, rolling half a turn in the sand before crashing down heavily. The ground trembled, my feet went numb, and my knees buckled involuntarily. That's when I finally saw it. From the sand pit emerged several enormous legs, as thick as utility poles, black and damp, covered in layers of hard shell, like shrimp or crab shells, glistening in the sunlight. The legs were lined with sharp, backward-facing barbs, their tips yellowed like rusty hooks. Each leg joint bent in the opposite direction, oozing a sticky, transparent fluid that dripped down the shell, leaving thin, stringy trails on the sand. These long legs pushed upward, and a massive body slowly rose from the pit. Its back was all hard carapace, with dark red, soft flesh pulsing in the gaps, constantly seeping slime. The creature propped itself up with a few legs while reaching forward with others, its claws wide open, each claw as long as my arm. It drove them deep into the overturned tank's armor. With a screech, the claws pierced straight through the thick plates, emerging on the other side, curling the metal edges outward. The monster hoisted the tank's chassis onto its back, its claws gripping the edges tightly, carrying the whole tank like a hermit crab tucked into a seashell. The first to fire was Miller. He cursed, raised his rifle, and fired off a full magazine. The bullets hit the monster's leg, splattering a large patch of green, gooey fluid. But the leg didn't react at all. The bullets just stuck into the hard shell like a few thumbtacks. Miller's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the magazine when trying to reload, and when he bent down to pick it up, it slipped again. "It's impenetrable," he shouted, his voice hoarse and terrifying to hear. Before I could yell for everyone to run, the monster's long leg suddenly swept sideways. It was just like the swing arm of a giant construction crane. That thick, long leg lashed out horizontally way faster than I expected. The wind it kicked up whipped sand into a wall 2 or 3 meters high, charging straight at us. The leg slammed down less than 3 meters from me, cracking the ground open with a huge fissure that spread from under my feet like a dried-up riverbed. The shock sent me flying, and I landed hard on my shoulder, sand instantly filling my collar. Barrett was to my right. The massive force flipped him over, sending him tumbling across the sand several times, his gun flying far away. He was just struggling to get up when the monster's leg swung again. This time, it came crashing down from above. I lay on the ground, watching helplessly as that thick leg slowly rose. The hard shell segments clacked against each other as the joint bent, making a cracking sound. It paused for a moment at its highest point, then slammed down fast. The armored vehicle door behind Barrett was ripped off. A several hundred-pound door instantly twisted and crumpled like crushed tin foil, flying through the air, spinning several times before smashing into a wrecked off-road vehicle with a bang, caving in half the roof. Barrett lay on the ground, unable to move, one leg twisted at an impossible angle, the bone pushing a strange bulge through his pants. He struggled to prop himself up and drag himself backward, clawing desperately at the sand. His nails worn down, but his injured leg was completely useless. Miller and 2 other comrades rushed over to pull him. I raised my gun and kept firing at the monster, the bullets clanging off its hard shell. A ricochet whizzed past my head, and I quickly ducked. The monster didn't bother chasing us. It used its long leg to push itself, lifting its body and the tank on its back even higher, slowly crawling out of the sand pit. With every step it took, the tank on its back swayed, the armor plates grinding against its shell with a harsh screech that set my teeth on edge, like little bugs burrowing into my ears. It crawled over to the tank that had been rotating its turret on its own and stopped. I thought it would go around that tank, but it didn't. All its legs pushed at once, and its massive body pressed straight onto that tank. The tank chassis on its back slammed into the other tank's turret, the collision of 2 heavy tanks sounding like 2 iron mountains crashing together. Then it extended its claws, dug them into the side of this tank, and pried it apart with force. One by one, the tank's armor plates were bent out of shape, rivets popping off with bangs, kicking up dust as they hit the sand. The seams of the steel plates were torn open, the edges curling slowly, ripping a hole in the tank's side big enough for a person to crawl through. The radio was in chaos. Someone was calling for backup, someone else panicking about triggering landmines, and others shouting coordinates, but no one could say what this monster was. The commander's voice suddenly cut in, urgently asking for a status update. I quickly replied, saying there was a living creature buried in the sand that had now burst out. The commander was silent for a few seconds, then just told us to hold our position and wait for further orders. So we just waited there, holding the line. Barrett was groaning in pain as his comrades dragged him back, his injured leg leaving a long trail in the sand beneath him stained dark. The medic crouched beside him, his hands covered in dark stains, tightly wrapping several tourniquets around him. Barrett bit down on a cloth strip, his eyes rolling back in agony, the veins on his neck bulging like they might burst. I fumbled to reload, my hands shaking so badly it took several tries to get the magazine in securely. I turned to look at Miller, who was hiding behind the wreckage of half an armored vehicle, his face pale, his lips moving but no sound coming out. After the monster finished with the 2 tanks, it slowly turned and started walking toward us. Its thick, long legs stomped into the sand, each step leaving a big pit, sand pouring down as it lifted them. The tank on its back jolted with each step, the cracks in it opening and closing. The hole in its head began to puff out air, one breath at a time, huff, 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 in a rhythm just like a person taking deep breaths. The monster walked on, then suddenly stopped. It was exactly as I had seen. It stopped dead in its tracks, standing still. Its long legs slowly retracted, joints bending backward with a creaking sound, inch by inch sinking into the sandpit. The tank chassis it had been carrying on its back also lowered, settling right over it like a hard shell, completely covering the entire monster beneath. Sand from all around flowed into the pit like water, cascading down the edges with a rustling sound, gradually burying those long legs and the edges of its carapace. In no time, the ground was leveled, leaving only a sunken hollow where the sand kept collapsing, spinning into a small vortex. The surroundings suddenly fell into a terrifying silence. The wind stopped, the gunfire ceased, leaving only Barrett groaning in pain. His voice was hoarse and raspy, as if a rag were stuck in his throat. We quickly dragged him behind the wreckage of a half-buried armored vehicle for cover. His injured leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, looking unsettling, with a large bulge swelling up high on the limb. The medic crouched down, took one look, and gasped sharply. He hurriedly applied a tourniquet, wrapping it 3 times, digging deep into the flesh until the skin was indented. The sand and oozing fluids around the wound had formed a dark, hard crust. Barrett bit down on his collar, his eyes rolling back, showing mostly white, with veins bulging on his neck. Each breath he took forced a pained grunt from his throat. The medic looked up at me and gave a slight shake of his head. We both knew it was bad. Just then, the radio crackled with the commander's shout, demanding to know what that strange thing I had reported was. I answered honestly, saying a living monster had emerged from the sand and even lifted the tank. There was a moment of silence on the other end, then a casual explanation came through. It was probably an underground gas pocket exploding, since this desert used to be near oil fields with many gas pockets. They added that an engineering team was already on its way and told us to hold our position and stay alert. Just a flippant remark, brushing it off as a routine gas blast. Miller leaned against the armored wreckage, his face pale as a ghost, lips dry and cracked. His rifle lay across his lap, his fingers still tightly gripping the handguard. He looked at me and I looked at him. We both knew the truth, but neither of us dared to say those 2 words. My gaze stayed fixed on the sandpit. The sand kept sinking, the vortex in the middle never stopping, clearly indicating a large cavity below still sucking in sand. The grains at the edge of the pit were jumping up on their own, not from the wind, like bubbles boiling in a pot. Then, slowly, a small object emerged from the center of the pit, black and shiny, like a polished stone. I immediately recognized it as the monster's carapace, covered in fine, curved lines that contracted and relaxed slowly, 1 beat at a time, terrifyingly slow. That thing hadn't gone far at all. It was hiding just beneath the sand, quietly waiting for us. At some point, a strange smell drifted into the air, sour, like old batteries and wire boiled in vinegar. It was harsh to breathe, drying and tightening the nose. The smell wasn't just coming from the sandpit. It seeped from all directions, growing stronger. The radio crackled with the engineering team's voice, mixed with static, saying they'd arrive in 15 minutes and asking us to mark the location of the ground collapse. Collapse zone? My finger rested on the radio's transmit button. I had so much to say, but after holding it for a few seconds, I finally let go without uttering a word. I plopped down onto the sand, my back against the hot armor plate, my hands still trembling. A magazine slipped from my hand and fell onto the sand. I bent to pick it up, but it slipped again, and I had to use both hands to finally load it into the rifle. Miller laid out his magazines 1 by 1 on the ground, neatly arranging 6 of them. He counted them once, then counted again to be sure, his lips moving slightly but making no sound. Barrett had grown weak, no longer making noise, only heavy, labored breathing. The medic crouched beside him, one hand gently pressing on his shoulder to comfort him. Over by the sandpit, the sand was sinking faster and faster, the vortex growing larger, and the edges of the pit began to crumble and collapse. I planted the rifle's muzzle into the sand, pointing upward, my finger lightly resting on the trigger guard, staring motionless at the ever-widening hollow, quietly waiting for what would happen next. The sourness in the air was so thick I could taste it, bitter in my mouth, my tongue pressing against the roof of my mouth, leaving a faint metallic bitterness. The noise of the engineering vehicle came from the east, the diesel engine chugging with a dull rumble, tracks grinding and crunching over sand as it crawled closer. The soldier driving shouted over the radio that he could see us and asked where the ground had collapsed. Miller had just raised his hand to signal when I suddenly heard a strange sound. It wasn't coming from the engineering vehicle. It was underground, right beneath that sand pit. A deep, muffled clank. Like a thick iron wrench being snapped in half, the sound rose from deep below. Then the track noise of the engineering vehicle changed abruptly, turning into a piercing whine of spinning wheels. The engine revved wildly, and the air filled with the smell of burning rubber. The engineering vehicle started sinking. It had stopped about 10 meters from the edge of the sand pit. Sand gushed out from under its chassis like a faucet had been turned on. The spinning wheels dug a huge hollow, and the vehicle didn't move forward or backward, it just sank straight down. The soldier inside quickly pushed open the door and jumped, but his feet sank to his calves the moment they hit the ground. He managed to pull one foot out, only to have the other sink deeper. Two more soldiers in the back scrambled down, crawling on their bellies over the sand, which was as soft as water. Every hand press left a deep hole. Then the entire ground began to shake. The sand pit exploded again, far more violently than before. Sand shot up over 10 meters high, slamming into the engineering vehicle's windshield and shattering it instantly. Shards of glass mixed with sand flew everywhere. The quicksand vortex in the center of the pit expanded rapidly outward, and the sand at the edges slid down like a waterfall. Several wrecked off-road vehicles nearby slid straight into the pit, their bodies tilting, rolling, swallowed by the sand without a sound. The pit grew larger and larger, from a small hole to about the size of a basketball court, and kept spreading outward. The monster stood up from the bottom of the pit. This time, it didn't hide under the tank chassis anymore. It revealed its entire massive body. The first things to emerge were those giant legs, even thicker than I'd seen before, fully extended with joints pushed to their limits. The soft flesh between the hard shell segments pulsed rhythmically, oozing sticky liquid. The long legs pressed down, causing a large patch of sand to collapse instantly. The huge claws at the tips dug deep into the hard ground at the edge of the pit, then pulled upward with force, yanking the entire body out of the sand. The tank chassis was still mounted on its back, but it was twisted and crooked. The crack in the chassis had grown longer, the edges curled up, revealing the broken inner armor. The monster used its front legs to brace against the pit's edge, kicked off hard, and flipped out of the pit with the iron shell still on its back, crashing heavily onto the sand. The ground shook violently, and both Miller and I were thrown backward. The monster stood fully upright. Before, when it was curled up inside the shell, I couldn't see its full form. Now it was clear. His body was flat, like a large oval, covered in segmented hard shells. The black-brown shells were interspersed with dark red soft flesh that kept writhing and oozing sticky fluid. Each shell segment had spikes along its edges, and on those spikes hung scraps of steel torn from the tank. The most horrifying part was its head. No eyes, no mouth, nothing resembling a normal creature, just a round, fleshy hole. The soft flesh around the hole contracted and expanded in rings, surrounded by long tentacles, each as long as my arm, writhing wildly in the air. From inside the hole emerged a pair of enormous black pincers, their surfaces gleaming like metal, lined with rows of sharp teeth. The pincers opened and closed, clashing together with a sound like two massive steel beams colliding. A deep, resonant clang that made your chest ache with every strike. These giant pincers clamped directly onto the turret ring of a nearby M1A2 tank. We had inspected this tank earlier. The turret ring was the tank's toughest component, forged from thick steel, about as thick as a fist. When the pincers clamped down, there was first a screeching sound of metal grinding. Then the sealing rubber rings around the turret ring flew off in pieces, and the small steel balls inside clattered onto the sand. The thick steel ring was squeezed out of shape, deformed from a perfect circle into an oval, its surface covered in dense cracks. The cracks grew wider, and fragments of steel kept falling off. Before long, the entire tank turret began shaking wildly. The barrel spun in circles, the motion growing more intense, and the next second, the whole turret was ripped straight off the chassis. I'll never forget the sound of it breaking. First a long, drawn-out screech of tearing metal, then a sharp crack as it snapped clean off. The heavy turret, still attached to the cannon, was hoisted into the air by the claw, with twisted pipelines dangling from its underside, oil and lubricant dripping steadily. The monster held the turret aloft for 2 seconds, then hurled it away with a violent toss. The several-ton hunk of iron tumbled through the air, crashing into a pile of wrecked tanks, slamming into 2 of them and knocking them over, while the engine cover of a third was bent upward from the impact. Miller was so startled that the magazine he was holding slipped from his hand and landed right on his boot. The radio descended into utter chaos. Someone was shouting about the monster's massive size. Another yelled that they were almost out of ammo, and someone else panicked, screaming that they had no idea what they were up against. The commander's voice cut through the noise, repeating over and over for us to hold our positions and wait for reinforcements. Then the monster slowly turned around. The tank chassis on its back began to slide downward, revealing a large crack running down the middle of its back. The hard shell split open, and from the gap, white mist hissed out in steady bursts. Wherever the mist touched the sand, it instantly turned black and brittle, forming a crust on the surface before crumbling into powder. The crack widened further, exposing another layer of carapace beneath that pulsed and contracted with each breath, each contraction releasing an even denser cloud of white vapor. Its massive claws spread wide once more, then slammed shut with a thunderous clang that echoed far into the distance. Then it took its first slow step toward the half-buried armored vehicle wreck where we were hiding. Someone dropped their rifle as if it were a red-hot piece of metal, raising both hands high in the air. The rifle hit the sandy ground with a slap, bounced once, and its muzzle plunged straight into the sand. That was Davis, the youngest in our squad. When he first enlisted, he didn't even have a beard yet. He turned and bolted, each step sinking ankle-deep into the soft sand, running in a clumsy, lopsided gait, even losing 1 boot in the process. He didn't stop, sprinting barefoot, the soles of his feet cut open by scattered shell casings, but he didn't dare slow down for a second. Then 2 more followed, one running east, the other west. The one heading west made it about 30 meters before tripping and face-planting into the sand. He scrambled up immediately and kept running, not bothering to pick up his helmet as it fell off, charging bareheaded into the depths of the desert. Miller screamed after them at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking, but the wind was howling so loudly I couldn't make out a single word. Only I stayed put. My legs felt nailed to the ground, completely unable to move. I crouched behind the wreckage of the half-destroyed armored vehicle, my back pressed hard against the sun-scorched steel plate, my fingers digging into the rifle grip so tightly that the skin under my nails turned white. From the knees down, my legs were completely numb. I pinched my thigh hard, but it felt like I was touching it through a thick layer of cotton. Barely any sensation. The monster moved slowly through the tank graveyard. With every step, the ground sank beneath its weight, leaving deep craters that oozed a green, viscous liquid that bubbled and gurgled. The tank chassis on its back had long since shifted, hanging crookedly off its side, the armor plates scraping against its hard shell with a piercing screech. The crack on its back had widened further, and the white mist poured out in thick, urgent bursts. Wherever the mist touched the sand, it turned from yellow to charred black, forming a crust that soon disintegrated into ash. Miller slumped down beside me, his legs stretched out straight in front of him, his rifle resting casually on his shoulder, barrel pointing skyward. His face was pale, his lips cracked and bleeding, with beads of blood clotting at the splits but not dripping. His eyes tracked the monster's movements, his body completely still, only his pupils shifting slowly. After a moment, he spoke, his voice eerily calm, as if he were making small talk. Even if you stepped on a tank mine, this thing probably wouldn't slow down. Then he fell silent, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, clearly terrified beneath the surface. The radio was in complete chaos. Someone was screaming in terror. Another's voice had gone shrill as they reported their position, and someone else kept shouting for a retreat over and over, their voice distorting until it no longer sounded human. Then the commander's voice cut in, repeatedly asking how long until reinforcements arrived, before devolving into a mechanical chant, telling us to stay put and wait for rescue. We were hiding behind the rear half of an armored vehicle. The middle of the hull had been torn apart, the jagged steel plates curling outward like the edges of a snapped cracker. The monster suddenly turned and came straight toward us, without any deviation. Its movements were slow but terrifyingly precise. The long tendrils around the circular hole on its head all pointed directly at us, each one stretched taut as if sensing the surroundings. Its large pincers were half open and half closed, gently clicking together with each step. It advanced step by step. The wreckage of the armored vehicle behind us began to shake continuously. With every step the monster took, the wreckage trembled. The joints where the steel plates hadn't fully broken off creaked and groaned, and small screws popped out of their holes, clinking and clattering at my feet. The curled edges of the steel plates were shaken even more, pieces falling off one after another. Miller remained motionless, sitting there staring at the approaching monster. His eyes glazed over and his pupils dilated. His lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. I reached out, grabbed the strap of his gear, and yanked him backward, dragging him to the ground. His back scraped across the sand, sliding half a meter. He was completely stunned, his eyes still fixed on the monster, not even changing the way he held his rifle on his shoulder. Just then, another armored vehicle behind us suddenly started up. There was still a driver inside that we hadn't noticed before. The diesel engine rumbled, black smoke billowed from the exhaust pipe, and the wheels spun in the sand several times before finally gaining traction. The vehicle lurched backward and began to reverse. The monster stopped in its tracks. All the tendrils on its head turned toward the armored vehicle at once, pointing in the same direction. Then it immediately changed course, all its long legs pushing together, lowering its entire body. The tank chassis hanging from its back dragged across the sand, carving a deep trench. It crawled toward the armored vehicle at a speed much faster than before, its hard shell segments clattering against each other with a series of crisp sounds. The armored vehicle backed up to the edge of a sand slope, and its rear wheels sank into the soft sand. The wheels spun uselessly, kicking up clouds of dust. Instead of backing out, the vehicle sank deeper. The engine roared wildly, black smoke thickened, and the smell of burning rubber from the overheated tires filled the air. The vehicle began to tilt to one side. The monster closed in on the armored vehicle 10 meters, 5 meters, 2 meters. It slowly raised one of its front legs. At that moment, I suddenly noticed its weakness. When the front leg lifted, the joint socket at the base was fully exposed. The hard shell in this area was extremely thin, almost translucent, revealing the dark green muscles underneath, contracting and stretching one by one. The muscles were as thick as my forearm, and with each twitch, a sticky fluid oozed from the shell seams. The thinnest part of the shell was right in the center of the joint socket, almost transparent, with a dark mass pulsing inside. There was no thick armor protecting it, just a thin shell covering soft tissue, directly connected to the body. Right at my feet lay a rocket launcher. It was an M72 model, which I had picked up from the scattered equipment pile. The tube was hot from the sun. I bent down, grabbed it, and held it in my hands, heavy and solid. Strangely, once I gripped it, my trembling hands gradually steadied. When Miller saw me hoist the rocket launcher, he snapped out of it. His eyes regained focus and his pupils contracted. He shook his head frantically, veins bulging on his neck, and forced out a whisper through clenched teeth. "You can't hurt it. If you fire, you'll just draw it straight to us." At that moment, a harsh metallic tearing sound came from the armored vehicle. The metal skin was being peeled off, the noise sharp and grating. The engine was still running, but its sound had turned strange, as if the exhaust pipe was blocked. Human cries for help came from inside. "There are 4 people in that vehicle," I said calmly. Miller stared at me blankly, but through the rocket launcher's scope, I locked onto the weakest spot in the monster's joint socket. The scope was simple, just a circle with crosshairs. I aligned the center of the crosshairs with that translucent thin shell, slowly steadied myself, and even slowed my breathing. The monster raised its front leg again, this time higher, fully opening the joint socket. The shell seemed stretched to their maximum, the muscles inside tense, and the pulsing mass beat faster. Then, the rear door of the armored vehicle was ripped off with a loud crash. After the metallic clang, there was a brief scream. The monster's raised leg slammed down toward the armored vehicle. The joint socket was fully open, completely unguarded. I pulled the trigger. The rocket launcher fired with a dull thud and a backward push, a large cloud of white smoke bursting from the muzzle. The projectile flew straight ahead, trailing a faint smoke trail, and from over 40 meters away, it struck precisely into the monster's open joint socket. A muffled explosion, like something detonating deep underground. Green slime mixed with shards of hard shell shot up high, sizzling as it hit the sand. That long leg froze in the air for a second. Then, like a broken crane arm, its joint bent backward, and the whole leg flopped limply onto the armored vehicle's roof, never moving again. That piercing, strange noise came first. It came from the round hole on top of its head. Not an ordinary roar, but a sharp shriek, like iron scraping glass or a steel saw cutting through a pipe, so shrill it stabbed into my ears with pain. Then a deep, low-frequency rumble followed, shaking my chest until it trembled. Suddenly, my nose felt hot, and warm liquid trickled down from my nostrils, reaching my lips. Tasted salty, with a metallic hint of rust. I wiped it with my hand, and my palm came away covered in red. Warm fluid was also leaking from my ears, sliding down the outer rim to my neck. This whole body tilted to the right. That rocket I fired had completely blown apart the joint of its right front leg, nearly severing the entire limb from the base. Only a few thick tendons held it together, and green slime gushed out non-stop, sizzling and steaming white on the sand. It couldn't support its heavy body, leaning sideways, and the tank chassis hanging on its back slipped off completely, flipping over and landing upside down with a long crack splitting the bottom. But it still didn't fall. It barely managed to steady itself with its remaining 5 legs, wobbling several times before stabilizing. The wound on the broken leg oozed green slime slowly, dripping down the hard shell and burning smoking trails into the sand. The antennae on its head all shot straight up toward the sky. Then in the next second, they bent down in unison, all pointing at me. Its massive pincers opened wider than ever before. The upper and lower jaws were fully spread, the gap between them big enough to fit an off-road vehicle. The soft flesh around the opening writhed constantly, dripping tank debris mixed with slime. Then all 5 legs pushed off at once, charging straight at us. 35 meters, 30 meters, it was much faster than before. It passed a wrecked tank, casually swept a leg across it, and the tank's barrel was sliced clean off. The cut was as smooth as if machined, shiny enough to reflect an image. The half-barrel spun in the air for half a turn before one end stuck into the sand, standing crooked like a road sign. I quickly dropped the rocket launcher and grabbed my rifle. Miller also got up and knelt beside me, resting his gun on his shoulder. We both opened fire, shell casings clattering against the armored vehicle's steel plates. But the bullets were useless. They left only white marks on the hard shell, the tips bouncing off. When they hit the soft flesh, they sank in, oozing a bit of green slime before being pushed back out. Even if we severed an antenna, it didn't affect it at all. Hitting the pincers only sparked a trail of harsh fire. "Reload," Miller shouted. I had just run out of ammo, quickly swapped the empty magazine, grabbed a new one, loaded it, and pulled the bolt to continue firing. By then, the monster had reached us. His huge pincer slammed down from above. I dove left, my mouth filling with sand. The pincer struck exactly where I had been crouching, snapping half an armored vehicle wreck in two with a clean cut, steel shards spraying onto the back of my neck. Miller rolled the other way, hiding behind the remaining half, got up and kept shooting. The monster lifted its pincer and slammed down again, crushing the other half of the armored vehicle, the steel plates twisting and flipping as they fell. The shockwave sent Miller tumbling, his gun flying out of his hands. He crawled forward on his elbows but fell again after 2 moves. I rushed over, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and dragged him backward with all my might. The soft sand made it hard to get any leverage, but after a huge effort, I managed to pull him 5 meters back. The monster slowly turned. Turning with a broken leg was tough. Its 5 legs shuffled in place, the hard shell scraping against the sand with a grating sound. Once it faced the other way, it dragged its injured leg and trudged slowly westward. Our ammunition supply truck was parked there. The soldiers on the truck had gotten off earlier to help with the wounded. The rear doors wide open, stacked with artillery shells and explosives. The driver saw the monster charging, jumped out of the cab, twisted his ankle, and limped desperately away. The monster sped up, its broken leg flailing in the air, green fluid splattering along the path. It rammed the supply truck head-on with its massive body.
À 10 une explosion érupted.
The truck's metal skin caved in instantly, the whole vehicle sliding 2 meters sideways, its wheels carving deep grooves in the sand. The door flew open, the windshield shattered into powder, and the steel frame groaned with twisting creaks. Then all the ammunition on the truck exploded at once. The massive shockwave sent me flying, my back slamming hard into a nearby tank wreck. My vision went black instantly, and the air was knocked out of my lungs. My ears were filled with nothing but a piercing ring, like I was trapped behind a thick wall, unable to hear a thing. A towering blaze shot up over 60 feet, rolling black smoke churning with fireballs as shells exploded one after another, the smoke dispersing only to gather again. Shards of metal and casings flew everywhere, clanging against the surrounding tanks. The air reeked of burnt rubber and gunpowder, a scorching wave of heat hitting me, tightening and drying my skin. Through the thick smoke, that thing was still moving. The blast had knocked it back a good distance, tearing off a large chunk of the hard shell on its back, a crack running from its neck all the way to its tail. The edges of the wound were charred and curled, the flesh beneath twitching faintly. The ground was littered with shell fragments, some buried in the sand, others resting on a crushed supply vehicle. One of its legs was broken too, twisted at a grotesque angle. The shell split open, exposing the quivering flesh inside. Even with all that damage, it still didn't fall. Using 3 good legs and 1 injured, broken one, it forced itself upright. Its body swayed violently, fluid seeping from the broken leg and the wound on its back, but it stood steady. The circular opening on its head turned toward me, most of its tentacles blown off, leaving only a few short ones standing. Its massive pincer opened and closed slowly, the movement sluggish but still radiating a terrifying presence. My rifle ran dry again. I patted down my vest pockets and pulled out the last full magazine, loading it in. Miller was on the ground, fumbling for his own gun. Sand had gotten into the barrel. He worked the bolt to clear it out, loaded a magazine, and kept firing at the opening on the creature's head. The bullets splashed green fluid when they hit, but the hole was too deep to reach anything vital. The creature stepped closer, 1 step at a time. Its 3 good legs dragged the injured one, the shell scraping against the sand with a rustling sound. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. White vapor rose from the crack on its back, mixing with slime to leave a wet trail on the ground. The spread of its pincer was just wide enough to engulf me entirely. I reached into the side pocket of my vest and pulled out my last weapon, a high-explosive rifle grenade. I glanced down at the launcher under my barrel. The safety was still on. I slowly slid the grenade into the tube, felt it click into place, and closed the cover. The creature was only 50 feet away now. Its injured leg dragged across the ground, claws scraping through the loose sand. The wound on its back was filled with sand and shrapnel, rising and falling with each movement. 40 feet. I dropped to one knee in the sand, pressed the stock tight against my shoulder to steady myself, flipped off the safety on the launcher, and raised the simple aiming sight. The crosshairs lined up perfectly with the circular opening on its head, locking onto the soft, writhing flesh inside. 30 feet. The creature lifted its front leg, the joint slowly extending, shell fragments falling off the injured area. The flesh tightened and contracted, its pincer opening to its fullest, the remaining tentacles pointing straight at me. I pulled the trigger without hesitation. A dull thud, and the grenade flew out lazily, tumbling through the air, slipping perfectly into the opening on its head. It hit the soft flesh and detonated instantly. The flesh around the opening blew outward, green fluid and chunks spraying everywhere, covering my face and head. The creature's pincer snapped shut with a final metallic clang. Then its head drooped heavily. Its front leg couldn't hold the weight, bending backward and cracking the shell, its massive body crashing onto the sand. Its hind legs kicked a few times instinctively, then went still. All its legs lay limp beneath it, the wounds still oozing fluid slowly. The large crack on its back gaped slightly, the flesh twitching faintly but slowing down, shell fragments falling off one by one. Finally, it lay there on the sand, completely motionless. A faint wisp of smoke drifted from the crack on its back, mixing with the strange smell of burnt shell, slowly spreading across the entire tank graveyard. The creature lay still on the ground, smoke slowly rising from the crack on its back, mingling with the foul stench of scorched shell. Its broken legs still twitched occasionally, its claws opening and closing, scraping against the sand with a soft rustle. I plopped down onto the sand, my legs stretched straight out, unable to bend my knees even if I tried. I clenched my fist and pounded my thigh, hitting it several times until the knuckles on my hand were red, but my legs remained numb, like they were wrapped in a thick blanket. I was about to keep hitting when Miller quickly reached over and grabbed my hand. My ears were still ringing, and I couldn't hear a thing, but from the shape of his mouth, I could tell he was telling me to stop. The medic crouched down beside me, pulled out a pair of scissors, and cut my left pant leg from the ankle all the way up to the thigh. The exposed leg looked completely off, pale and bluish, with patches of purple bruises scattered across the skin, as if it had been crushed from the inside. The medic pressed on my knee, and where he pushed, a small dent formed, taking a long time to bounce back. He looked up and spoke to me. I couldn't hear the words, but reading his lips, I understood it was a severe injury from crushing. The ambulance that came for us was a modified armored vehicle, with the rear compartment just big enough for 3 stretchers. 2 people flanked me, one on each side, my arms draped over their shoulders. My toes couldn't muster any strength, so they dragged me across the sand, the soles of my boots leaving 2 long trails behind. As we passed by the monster, its severed leg suddenly twitched again. A claw hooked sharply, kicking up a handful of sand that hit me right on the shin. The soldier supporting me instinctively dodged to the side, nearly dropping me to the ground. The engineers were already busy, hauling orange fuel barrels and dousing the monster with oil. The oil trickled down through the gaps in its hard shell, seeping into the soft flesh with a sizzling sound. Someone struck a match and tossed it over. The match spun in the air a few times before landing on the oil. At first, a ring of small blue flames crept along the shell, burning slowly. Then, in the next second, it erupted into a massive blaze. Orange-red flames, wrapped in black smoke, shot skyward. The smoke coalesced into a thick pillar, rising straight up in the windless desert, visible from far away. I was carried onto the armored vehicle. As I lay down on the stretcher, my back scraped against a metal plate in the compartment. I turned my head and saw a bullet casing wedged in the gap of the plate. Just before the door fully closed, I took one last look outside through the crack. The entire tank graveyard was shrouded in thick black smoke. 4 or 5 tanks lay twisted and slumped on the sand, some missing their turrets, others with huge gashes torn in their hulls. The ground was pockmarked with craters, each filled with green slime slowly drying and solidifying. The towering pillar of black smoke still stood straight in the air, not dissipating at all. The door slammed shut with a bang, instantly blocking the scene outside. Miller sat across from me, his lips cracked and dry, with beads of blood clotting in the fissures. He stared blankly at the tips of his boots, which were caked with sand and dried green stains. He opened his mouth as if to say something, his lips moving a few times, but no words came out. Then he slowly opened his palm. I saw a small fragment of the monster's shell in his hand, no bigger than his thumbnail, shiny black, with a tiny spike on the edge. No one expected it, but that little piece of shell twitched slightly in his palm. Just then, the vehicle jolted hard. The fragment slipped from his hand, fell onto the metal floor, bounced a couple of times, and then lay still, motionless.